Climate 7, Climate Change, Climate Action Pathways, Conversation with Quamrul Chowdhury, Episode 8. Today on carbon pricing, market mechanism and non-market mechanism. We have a very rich panel with us. Georg Børsting from Norway. He has been in this process for many moons, and in climate parlance, he is one of the old hand. Martin Nassian from European Union. He has also been for quite long. Andrea Santos. She has also been in climate negotiation for many years, and now she is a professor of University of Brazil, Federal University of Rio de Janeiro. And we have Kabe Gulianpur. He has also been in the negotiation for quite long, but now he is with C2ES based in UK. We are also expecting a couple of others in this panel, but without much ado, I would like to start this conversation. You know that International Renewable Energy Association and World Resource Institute estimate that share of renewable must grow exponentially and share of fossil fuels decreased accordingly. The level of ambitions needs to be fivefold to align to 1.5 degree world. It's a Herculean task. Such a massive system change can't be achieved without very strong political will and actions on the ground. And for that, we would like to discuss at this conversation how we can put a price on carbon, how to limit it, how to value it, how to calculate it, how to estimate it, and also improve the system, improve the methodology, improve the rule, improve the architecture. And also for that, we'd also look at Article 6 of the Paris Agreement, the market mechanisms and non-market mechanisms, how it will work, how to frame the rules, how to frame the framework. So without much ado, I would like to ask Georg to kick off the discussion, conversation. Georg Børsting.
Yeah,
Georg.
thank you, Quamrul, and thanks for inviting to this discussion. I think most people who know Norwegian climate policy would know that carbon pricing is core in our policies, both domestically and internationally. We have always seen carbon pricing as generally the most efficient way of achieving climate targets. It gives producers and consumers and investors the right incentives to make climate-friendly choices. And we also feel that putting a price on emissions creates a basis for flexible and also decentralized and informed actions. I think in our experience, it's also, I guess, a lesson that to be successful, carbon pricing policy has to be well aligned with the broader policy context in a country. So Norway's experience with carbon pricing in that context is just an example. It's not a recipe for how to implement carbon pricing. Pricing emissions can be done by taxes or through emissions trading. And in Norway, we do both. A CO2 tax was actually introduced already in 1991. Emissions trading was introduced in 2005. And today, over 80% of Norwegian emissions are subject to the CO2 tax and or covered by the emissions trading system. And this includes the large petroleum sector that we have in Norway. So we are also the first country to introduce a green tax, a mineral oil tax, and the second one to introduce the CO2 tax. There has been research done into the effectiveness of the CO2 tax, and there are numbers that are showing that, at least in Norway, our emissions would have been 10 to 15% higher than they are today without the use of taxing or carbon pricing. So for us, this has been a efficient measure, and it's also a measure that we are continuing to use for the future. I can say a bit more about the plans of the government for the future also. So that's just for an introduction.
Yeah. So, Georg, as you said, it is working quite well in Nordic countries, including Norway. Martin, how do you say, in a layman's language, what is carbon pricing? And how it works in your world? Well, what is your take?
In my world, I mean, the definition is putting a price on carbon one has to pay to emit. And as Georg was saying, it can either be a tax or an emissions trading system. In the European Union, we have an emissions trading system covering all of the 27 member states and beyond. Norway, Iceland, Liechtenstein also participate in that trading scheme. And it covers more than half of our emissions. And it's always contributed to our international and domestic climate goals. The sectors that are covered are asked to do more generally than other sectors. So the power generation and the large industrial sectors are asked to contribute. I think it's in the range of 45% to our current 40-degree target. And we're revising the legislation now in the light of new targets. So essentially what we do is we say to the companies that are within the emissions trading scheme, you can only emit this amount, but you can trade that amount with others. And that creates the price and the flexibility to implement climate policy in that way. We've recently adopted our carbon neutrality goal for 2050 and a 55% goal for 2030. So our legislation is being revised to upgrade the targets for emissions trading and also in the other sectors. And in response to that, we've seen the prices grow quite significantly as people anticipate the price will need to increase because carbon will be scarcer. And we're putting ourselves on a trajectory to net zero or climate neutrality in 2050. Which will lead to relatively high carbon prices in the medium term.
Okay, Martin. Andrea, what is your take? And in the meantime, we have Pedro Martin Berta from Portugal. He has also been in this process, climate negotiation, for many months. Welcome, Pedro.
Thank you very much.
Andrea. Andrea, your take.
Thank you again for the invitation. It's a pleasure to be here with you all.
I'm from the academia, I'm also
a negotiator.
I'm trying to support the negotiation. Different scenario in Brazil because of the new government. So, but what I would like to point is we are discussing internally and how we could make or break the Paris Agreement in considering the Article 6, and also consider the topic, the voluntary cooperation via Article 6 mechanisms, and also how we can work to allow for higher ambition in the mitigation and adaptation actions. So in Brazil, the principal initiative that it's led by the Minister of Economy is the Partnership for Market Readiness, we say PMR, but I confess that we are in a very difficult momentum in Brazil to discuss about how we can promote a good proposal regarding Article 6 and the carbon pricing. And we are working with other non-organization entities like World Business Council for Sustainable Development in Brazil and other initiatives. But the last point that I have, Quamrul, is we are discussing, we see that the government is always considered benefits of countries cooperating to reduce emissions, but also they are discussing how we could make or break the Article 6 in terms of the Paris Agreement. So my first point.
Okay. So, Kaveh, you have heard other panelists. So now, what is your take? What is your perspective?
Thanks, Quamrul, for inviting me, and hello to colleagues and some old friends. I feel a little bit of the odd one out here because, unlike the others, I'm not really a carbon markets or pricing expert, but maybe that brings a different perspective to the conversation. So, I mean, I think what you said at the start, Quamrul, is that we face a really Herculean task. There really needs to be a paradigm shift. There's all these commitments to net zero by 2050 by national level governments, but also by the private sector. And the truth is that's going to be an extremely difficult thing to achieve. Similarly, to have the 2030 NDCs that are in line with that is going to be a massive shift. I mean, Martin and others will have the numbers, but the kind of trajectory that you need in terms of emissions reductions to achieve a pathway consistent to that is really challenging. I mean, it's possible, but it's challenging. So it's going to be really critical, I think, unlike the first round of NDCs, which I guess were the first experiment, to engage all sectors of the economy, including the private sector. And I think that the the notion of carbon markets and carbon pricing will be vital to send a signal, but also to incentivize that kind of participation by all aspects of the economy. And the thing that, from my perspective, from a little bit outside the carbon conversation, the pricing conversation, the markets conversation, I think Andrea touched on it, is that you see increasing focus on the voluntary carbon markets, and this is going to happen regardless of whatever is discussed in the UNFCCC, whatever is agreed in the UNFCCC, or what's not agreed there, which may not be a very popular thing to say, but it's the reality. We're already seeing it. So there's a real risk that the UNFCCC discussions get left behind what's really happening out there. So I think it's important to reach conclusions on Article 6 in Glasgow, but not at any price. It has to be in a way that the outcome ensures real credibility and integrity of the system. You're already seeing some controversies in the private sector commitments to net zero underpinned by offsets or carbon pricing, there's a lot of skepticism around their integrity and validity. So I think Article 6 can give a good example for that at the national level. But I mean, this is where I'm looking to others on your panel. But as far as I understand it, entities like the EU, I think the US, China are not indicating that they are relying on international trading to achieve their net zero commitments. So, you know, the pressure is to get that system right. And I think the biggest value it has is showing the example to the voluntary sector. But I might be completely wrong, but that's my perspective from slightly outside the negotiations. Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Kabir. Pedro, thanks for joining. And I think you are negotiating it for many years and have seen the ups and downs of CDM, GI, and also evolution of the ETS. So how do you foresee in the future the carbon market, carbon pricing, and market mechanism can get its integrity? How can we frame the rules, fix the rules, framework?
Okay, thank you, Quamrul. And first of all, sorry for being a little bit late, but that's a very good question. In terms of, I think we have to be clear about a couple of things. The framework that we had under the Kyoto Protocol and the one that we have now under the Paris Agreement is radically different in many ways. So let's say the conditions under which the clean development mechanism and the mechanisms that you mentioned, the joint implementation mechanism, were operating are not going to be there for this future periods. The second point that I want to make about this distinction, and I think the most clear distinction is we have under the generical rubric of carbon pricing, we have a suite of instruments. And most people have looked at carbon markets and identified two types of mechanisms: cap and trade on one hand, and baseline and credit, or so-called offsets, where essentially, as Kabir was pointing out, you pay somebody else to reduce for you. Now, the important thing here is that paying somebody else to reduce for you means that you yourself are allowed an increase. So an offset is not going to reduce total emissions if it is in that construct. And so as we go to carbon neutrality, which is what we are mandated to under the Paris Agreement, there's an obvious diminishing role for offsets. So instruments like the Clean Development Mechanism would, in all cases, need to be phased out. The same does not apply exactly in the same way for emissions trading. And that's what we're seeing. We're seeing a lot of emissions trading initiatives popping up, put it this way, around the world, whether it's in regions of the US, in countries in Latin America. In Brazil, several states have at some point considered emissions trading. And then the key question is, what is all of the relationship of all of these initiatives to the Paris Agreement? And to my mind, the relationship boils down to an essential question, which is, how are these trades, if they are going to be linked, if these mechanisms are going to be linked, how are they going to be reflected in the accounting for the contributions of the Paris Agreement? And that's where the discussions on both Article 6.2 and the rules on corresponding adjustments and Article 6.4 have been going on for many years. I haven't been, luckily enough for me, in the room, but I'm sure Martin and others can vouch for how difficult these questions are. But I think those are critical points. And then one last comment about what Kaveh just said. there is right now a surge in voluntary carbon markets, i.e. in this idea that at a company level, one can have a net zero target and get to it by using offsets. Now, the important thing to say here is, first of all, that net zero target ought to be framed as well in a carbon neutrality frame. And that means that companies cannot simply offset everything. And the second point is that, and it's quite unfortunate that the task force that Mark Carney led didn't pronounce itself on the relationship between these voluntary carbon markets and the discussions that we're having under the Paris Agreement on corresponding adjustments. And it's unfortunate because there is almost an expectation in the private sector right now that anything goes in terms of accounting. And that's going to be problematic, I think, further down the line for the negotiations.
Thank you, Pedro, for elaborating a couple of issues. So, Georg, you have in your country and also in your region some success stories. But all said and done, the price of carbon has been plummeting, say mostly below $10 per ton. So, if we want to have say heavy reliance on carbon pricing, carbon market, then this price, do you think will help promote say emission trading and also carbon trading, or say net zero target or 1.5 degree world?
Well, I think I want to just attack that in two parts, because what you're saying about the carbon pricing, the carbon price, is referring to the price in the EU emissions trading market. But let me first just say that, as we talked about in the introduction, carbon pricing is not only emissions trading; it's also taxes, right? Yeah, and in Norway, I think we have the highest, or one of the highest, CO2 taxes per ton. And in fact, the Norwegian government recently put out its plan for its climate policies for the next decade up to 2030, and announced then that it will seek to more than triple the tax on carbon dioxide by 2030. That will increase the charge of a ton of emitted CO2 equivalents from around 60 euros today up to 200 euros, which is quite a leap in 10 years time. And the white paper that was put out outlined that this would achieve up to a 45% reduction in emissions that are not falling under the emissions trading system by 2030. So that is part of what's not covered then by the emissions trading system. As far as the ETS, the emissions trading system, of course, it's the targets, it's an ambition that drives prices. And of course, we hope that both the target that Norway now has put out for a cut by 2030 by 50 to 55% compared to 1990 level, and the EU is up to at least 55, that would send a sufficient signal into the trading system also, that will subsequently also be followed by a spike in carbon prices, and do what the system is intended to do, that is to drive change in both driving innovation in technologies, but also, of course, patent chains from consumers to producers.
Okay, good. Martin, we have seen that communicating carbon pricing is at times problematic. Sometimes it is misunderstood, sometimes it is misinterpreted. So how to have, say, remove this sort of distortions? How to, say, make it a perfect system?
Yeah, I mean, if I could follow on, I don't think it is that complicated, and I think we tend to make it too complicated, and I agree with that. I think one of the fundamentals here, building on what Kaveh, Pedro, and Georg have been saying, is that this is a means to an end, and the crucial thing in all carbon pricing is the target, setting a cap on the emissions, and that's why emissions trading effectively sets a price, and offsets are a price taker. They don't deliver a price on their own because there's no cap on emissions.
Right.
Now, the truth is that within Europe, we have adopted a domestic goal of 55% because we think that's what puts us on the pathway to carbon neutrality. If we offset with respect to that, our emissions will be higher and we will not be on that pathway. So that's the first thing to understand. I think the second thing is that our prices are now at 41 euros as a result of our proposal to 255. Now, in the Article 6 context, and I think this is what's really important, and also for the voluntary market, we are having something very good happening. Countries, governments, businesses are all committing to carbon neutrality. And there's an effort to head towards that goal. But there are some things that are missing or that are not clear. One is the need for a medium-term target. It's not enough to promise something for 30 years ago. We need to start now. And the second thing is the accounting, as others were pointing out. Because there's only one planet, there's only one set of emissions. And if we don't align the accounting systems between countries, and also between countries and companies, we will have double counting, and we will be fooling ourselves. That's a massive issue in the Article 6 negotiation, which is what we break down on. And it's also an emerging issue in voluntary markets, where I think there are some voluntary markets that feel they can continue to account in parallel, which I don't think is the case. So you asked me a question, how do we make it simpler? Targets, short-term as well as long-term, that are consistent with what we need to do. And accounting, that means that this all adds up. It's very simple, but somehow we've lost track of that.
Yes. Okay, to make it very clear, then people will understand. Then Andrea, how to ensure the integrity of the system? How you foresee the future aligning Paris Agreement, Article 6, and also net zero, that pathway, short term, medium term, and long term? Andrea?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. So, Quamrul, for a long time, we were involved. I think Brazil was the first or second player regarding the CDM mechanism for a long time under the Kyoto Protocol. Regarding the opportunities, we say lessons learned from the CDM, or I'm sure in Europe, in joint implementation, we think to discuss this kind of opportunities. And what I see, as Martin said, regarding the business sector, is also very concerned regarding the necessity to move in a low carbon or emissions future. So I think the principal key message is how we have to involve all actors and to create this new mechanism, the market mechanism. And also, I think in Brazil, the position is we need to consider also the CDM experience in the past, and also the benefits of country, as I told before, cooperating to reduce emissions. But it's clear for me that we need to discuss the net zero emissions. So the scientific, the IPCC and the academic community is saying we don't have time. Also, and in every year, every COPs, we are discussion under the Article 6, and we see that we have a climate emergency. So it's not, we are considered a climate emergency around the world. And I can see that business sectors and also are worried about this, and the society in general. So this is my opinion, is an important point that we have to consider here. Thank you.
Kabe.
Thanks, Quamrul.
Yes.
So, I mean, it's an interesting discussion, and I'm learning a lot from it. It's probably not the place to learn about carbon pricing, but I mean, I was struck by some of the comments that have been made. I mean, one in particular is the relationship between offsets and net zero commitments. Because if you think about, I mean, I think at this stage, if you really want to achieve net zero, everyone has to have a place at the table. And there's some sectors and stakeholders that are going to find it much more difficult to do that transition in the near term than others. So I think to bring those to the table, the question of offsets still needs to be, you know, it still is a live one. And I think it needs to be considered how that relationship between offsets and net zero would work. I mean, Pedro touched on it. And I think that's a question, you know, we need to incentivize that transition and not make it so impossible that, you know, some of the difficult sectors become opponents to the transformation rather than participants. So I think that's one thing. And then I think something else that Martin touched on, which is something I've thought about for years, particularly working with some of the colleagues on your panel. You know, it seems to me that it's not rocket science, the question of accounting and how you avoid double counting. And I've always thought that, you know, the sort of international accountancy firms and financial institutions have been doing this for decades across jurisdictions. And I think now that you have the voluntary markets arising, I think you're going to have that situation now where, as I say, I think there's a real risk that UNFCCC negotiations get left behind the reality of the real economy, or whatever a better phrase is. So I think that point that Martin made is how do you align the accounting between countries and within countries and companies to avoid double counting and have confidence in the system is really the key question. Yeah, I mean, I think there's a real danger. I don't think it's a technical problem anymore. You know, everybody knows what the problems are. Everyone knows how to do it. It's a political problem. And the politics is getting left behind by the reality. You know, that's the real, I think that's a real opportunity and a real danger.
So every opportunity, every crisis has an opportunity. Pedro.
Let me just unmute.
Pedro.
Yes.
Can you hear me? Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you.
Yeah.
Can I react to Kabe's point about offsets in difficult sectors?
Yeah.
One of the key things is that for many years. Sorry?
Hello.
Yeah. One of the key things is that for many years, there was a little bit of proselytism around carbon markets. So this notion that carbon markets were the main the main instrument, if you want, for achieving our emission reductions. And there's still a lot of that thinking in the private sector. The reality is that we're seeing massive emission reductions in sectors sometimes that are not covered by any carbon pricing instrument. So carbon pricing instruments can help if they're well managed, like everything else, can really drive innovation, and they're certainly good for private sector participation, but we shouldn't fetishize them. So when you come back to this issue of the really difficult sectors to decarbonize, we're talking about really high energy intensive sectors, things like steel, things like aluminium, etc., where the cost of switching from different power types of power is not going to be covered by the carbon price. You'd need a very high carbon price to do that. Well, then you have to look elsewhere and not necessarily say, let's allow these sectors to just simply do nothing or do very little and offset. Because even these sectors, when we get to 2050, 2060, will no longer be able to offset. If we really are serious about carbon neutrality, sectors like steel, sectors like, well, one of the prime candidates right now, shipping, for example, global shipping is increasing at a very fast rate. We cannot simply allow them to do nothing and then offset for the entire, for an entirety. On top of that, we certainly shouldn't allow any of this offset to be thought of as, because it eventually would amount to greenwash. If I allow a company to just do nothing and buy offsets from wherever, that company is not really contributing to emission reductions. And yet it could claim, under certain understandings, it could be claiming a net zero slogan. And I think that's the real danger with some of the things that we're seeing in the private sector.
So Martin, I think you are trying to respond to Gabi's intervention.
Yeah. I mean, following on again from Pedro, I think it's completely right to say that the carbon market offers enormous opportunity. But it's also, we need to be really clear about the risks if we don't get it right. On Kabe's point, the voluntary market is definitely where the action is at the moment. They're promising money and promising scale, and they're large corporations that are saying they want to go beyond what policy says at the moment. And so there's a lot of excitement there. But you need to look at the numbers, and you need to look at whether that's going to deliver the scale of action that actually we need to have, and whether it can do that without a policy framework that gives it the accounting framework that makes it all add up. And I myself am skeptical, because at the moment, as I think somebody has said, that the work that's going on voluntary carbon markets, they are hedging on whether there needs to be accounting, and that they can't continue to do. I wanted to raise the issue of some of the risks. Like we know the carbon markets can deliver large amounts of money to the right sorts of investments. We can also know that they can be incredibly wasteful. So if there are very cheap abatement options within the market, you can have large financial flows that deliver windfall profits and don't do society any good. Sometimes the market doesn't like to hear that, but you have massive transfers to small numbers of projects and small numbers of people, and it's overall economically not efficient. And so there's an argument to have some of the cheapest abatement options outside the market, and it should be dealing with deployment of the medium cost abatement options. And then we also know that there are things that are more expensive than the carbon price. And we also know that there are negative impacts of carbon markets, in the sense that there will be shifts in jobs, shifts in economic activity. And so within the EU, one of the issues that we're very interested in is just transition within the EU as well as more broadly. And how do you manage the impacts of the shift? And carbon markets can contribute to that, because there are revenues from emissions trading that allow us to invest in technology and social change, etc. And I think that's a very important thing to think about. And then my final point on another sort of equity question is that, of course, if you've got the wealthy buying up the cheapest abatement, There's an environmental and an equity concern, in the sense that the environmental concern is that there are some sectors that have relatively cheap costs of abatement that will offset relatively early, and leaves those with very expensive options without those options in the future. So you have a kind of a crash in terms of price in the medium term, and that's something that needs to be considered in managed.
So those are the risks.
Yes.
Georg, how do you respond?
Respond to what?
Respond to Martin, Pedro, and Kabe.
Well, I don't think I have that much to add to the question of risks. I agree with what Martin is saying. As of course, as with any type of measures that you put in place, you need to you need to do this properly and with integrity. I do think though that with now soon up to 20 years of experience with emissions trading and much longer than that with taxation as a policy instrument, there is a rather large period of experience that has been growing, at least in the EU and Europe, that hopefully others also can learn from. I just wanted to, beyond what we now have been talking about as far as carbon pricing as domestic measures, I do want to add a comment on what Pedro was talking about as far as instruments under the Paris Agreement. What we are talking about as Article 6, not to discuss about the details of the intricacies of the negotiations on Article 6, but I think from a Norwegian perspective, at least, we believe that trading, carbon pricing is obviously an instrument, as I said, that we hope that countries will find valuable at the domestic level through CO2 taxes and stuff, but trading between countries as part of the broader global system under the Paris Agreement, we believe is in the long term going to be crucial in order to be able to raise ambitions even further than they are today. And I can only say that from the Norwegian experience, that the rather ambitious targets that we have taken on earlier under the Kyoto Protocol and also presently under the Paris Agreement, although much of that is achieved through domestic reductions, we are, for instance, in a emission structure where we have almost zero emissions coming from our electricity power sector, and much of our emission reductions will have to be taken in areas where the cost of reduction is extremely high. So taking on such ambitious targets that we have done would not have been possible without being able to also use instruments as in international emissions trading would allow us or allows us to do under in the European context. And we believe this is the same for quite many other countries. We want to have that type of flexibility also in a global system that would allow countries to go further in their ambitions than they would have been able to do if they're only going to do this in a domestic context. So the Article 6, while it's not, at least for us, is not a crucial article or a crucial instrument in the next decade. I think also for us and for other countries, it will be certainly in the long term, in order for us to achieve the long-term goals of the Paris Agreement. It's a crucial element of the agreement.
Yeah, true. Article 6 is a crucial one for in the longer run for very many developing countries and developing countries. Gabriel, what is your final take?
Thanks, Quamrul. I mean, I think the point raised by Martin about the equity issue is an important one. I mean, Martin made the point that if you take companies and they buy offsets, they're not really, they're capturing low-hanging fruit and are not really contributing. And again, I'm not anywhere near the expertise of Martin, Andrea, and others on this topic. But I mean, the argument, I guess, goes that they're contributing the investment of a transition and they're buying time. So I think as long as the framework is there for companies or those relying on offsets internationally to transition with time and don't do what Martin and Pedro warned about, that they basically do absolutely nothing and then buy their way out to a cliff edge, then I still think that there must be a role to play. But I think the equity point that Martin raised is important, because if countries are selling their low-hanging fruit because they need to for economic reasons, how is that equity issue addressed? And the traditional point, of course, has been the notion of share of proceeds under the CDM, and now, if I quote correctly, 6.2 of the Paris Agreement. But from what I understand, when you look at it, this hasn't delivered the flow of finance needed to fund the adaptation fund, for example, which has relied, again, if I understand correctly, largely on voluntary contributions from particular countries, which everyone on your panel knows who they are. So I think there's a big expectation that Article 6 negotiations are going to deliver on the equity point through the share of proceeds, but on the 6.4, which I think where most of the action will be, if I'm correct again, I don't think it will be under 6.2. If it's under 6.4, that doesn't have a provision for share of proceeds. I mean, we may wish that it was there, but it's not there. I think there's a real expectation that agreeing to Article 6 will suddenly unlock a lot of flow for adaptation as a way to address equity, but there's no evidence at all that that's been the case in the past. And I don't think we should rely on that it'd be great if it does deliver as a bonus, but there's no evidence that it has or that it will. So I think I think Martin raises a point that we need to think about how does this work and make sure that it does. And that's where the politics comes in and not the technical point. Are countries willing to allow or have some novel thinking to allow the equity point to be raised there and addressed? Thank you.
Yeah. So what Kabe raised. Martin.
Sorry, I just need to follow on that. I think, first of all, you need to flip it around. It's 6.2 and 6.4, the other way around.
Yeah.
In terms of vision. But I do think that the issue of the balance of ambition between mitigation and adaptation is definitely an issue. And it's an issue of equity. But that's not the only issue. The issue I was talking to is equity in terms of actual mitigation. And I think it's fine that countries and companies chase the cheapest abatement. The question is whether the countries and companies have the capacity to manage the transition. And I think we have lots of experience in Europe with emissions trading, and we have lots of experience in many developing countries with CDM, and some they have very little experience. And we're moving into a different world. And I think that the ability to manage the transition to neutrality is not even. And mistakes could be made. And that's why we insist on issues around countries being ready and able to manage their emissions as a precondition for participation in markets, because things can go wrong if that is not there. And obviously capacity support is needed to help countries do that. Sorry, but the market should not be the first thing, the first mitigation option.
Yeah. Mitigation is the best adaptation also. mitigation. We have to mitigate at any cost. And political will is essential. Thank you. And Andrea, what is your final take? Your reflection, final message.
To contribute to, yeah, okay. So I agree with the point made by Martin, and I think regarding equity, it's an important topic that we have to consider all the time in the process when you discuss about a cap and trade program. And also we have to pay attention regarding laws or regulations that will limit the cap carbon emissions, and also consider how this market could help countries to achieving NDCs under the Paris Agreement, and also considering the integrity, equity, and also the sustainable development goals. So you all remember under the Kyoto Protocol, when we discussed about CDM projects, for example, the sustainable development goal and has to be approved and included in the process, for example, in a project. So this is my final point, and I would like to thank you again for the invitation.
Thank you. Georg, your final message.
Sorry, unmuted. Oh, I guess I don't have any final message other than, of course, carbon pricing is an instrument. You know, it's not an aim in itself. It's an instrument to achieve an aim, and I do think that it has to be adapted to, as I said initially, to various circumstances in various countries, but I think there is enough experience on it now in order for countries to learn from those that have gone in the forefront of using either taxation or emissions trading, and at least been working for us, and we think it's going to be the foundation for Norway's side, our future climate policy. But it's not the only instrument. We are, of course, it's one part of a larger toolbox.
Thank you. Here, Pedro, your final word.
I just wanted to come back to this issue of equity and ambition, just for a final remark, just to make clear that as much as we want to have equity addressed through mechanisms like the adaptation fund and the share of proceeds to feed that, the share of proceeds construct, for example, was totally reliant on the level of revenues you get from the CDM. This was in the Kyoto Protocol. And if it were solely reliant on the level of revenue from the CDM, implicitly, it is reliant on having a very strong demand for CDM, i.e. if you don't have demand for CDM, there is no funding for adaptation. So to put it back into the new Paris framework, equity essentially has to level of ambition. Unless you have a well-functioning carbon market that delivers a strong distortions, and those distortions will be seen by people essentially, as Martin was saying, sourcing the cheap opportunities from developing countries instead of actually having a hard look at what they're doing. So to take the example of Norway, Norway has a very early on commitment to carbon neutrality. It is engaging in carbon markets. So one could say, and I haven't done, to be honest, a full analysis of Norwegian NDC, but at least there's a presumption that there's a level of ambition there. And so from that basis, from that level of ambition, then Norway can amplify that ambition by using offsets for a certain period of time. What we cannot allow is to have, in Paris terms, not ambitious enough NDCs and then follow that up with lacks mechanisms also in relation to sustainable development, for example, and lacks accounting. That would be the worst possible outcome. And I think with that, I close and thank you very much.
Thank you. Martin, any other point left?
Oh, I feel I've talked too much. Just to say thank you very much to everybody. It's been really interesting.
So it was a great pleasure to have you all in this conversation. It was really quite interesting, and I think those who listen, watch this, they will really enjoy it. They have enjoyed it, and wish we can have another round maybe in May. Next month on the same issue, same topics, so that we can have a common understanding and the messages can go across. With that, I would like to stop here. Thank you very, very much. And hopefully we will have you in another round, another time, with another issue. Thank you very much on behalf of Climate Center.
Or the problem will only
Bye-bye.
So it's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
At least we could meet virtually. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you all.
Bye.
Hope to see you in Glasgow. I hope to see you all.
Yeah, see you in
I'm
Glasgow.
not sure.
Let's hope so.
Yeah.
Be there. We'll be there.
Take care.
Martin, thank you.
Thanks, Quamrul.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Georg. So you haven't said. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
So it's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
At least
Thanks.
we could meet virtually.